From the height of his power in Europe in early 1810, Napoleon and his empire collapsed in spectacular fashion. Two events in particular played a crucial role in contributing to Napoleon's downfall: the Peninsular War from 1808 to 1814 and the invasion of Russia in 1812. To try to secure the defeat of Britain, Napoleon decided to enforce the continental system much more rigorously. In 1808, he invaded and occupied the Papal States in an attempt to force the Pope to impose this strategy. However, British goods were continuing to enter Europe via their long-standing ally, Portugal. Portugal's more powerful neighbor, Spain, was a country very much in decline, whose government and vast overseas empire in the Americas were ruled very inefficiently. Napoleon invaded Spain to ensure the continental system was fully enforced and to stop British imports from entering the Iberian Peninsula. Napoleon, on the 5th of May, 1808, deposed the Spanish king and his heir and placed his own brother Joseph on the throne. There were a number of consequences from this decision. Some of the consequences were large numbers of ordinary Spanish people rose in revolt against French rule. Maintaining garrisons in Spain proved to be a significant drain on French military resources. The Franco-Spanish attack on Portugal prompted Britain to commit military forces to defend its ally, and Napoleon's inability to resolve the situation cast doubts on his military and political judgment. As soon as Joseph arrived in Spain in May 1808, he was confronted by a revolt in Madrid, which was put down by the French with great violence. 100 Spaniards were executed in retaliation for killing 31 Frenchmen. The artist Goya's horrific images helped rouse the whole population to patriotic anger against the French occupying forces. Local resistant committees called juntas were set up and coordinated by clergy and members of the nobility to raise guerrilla fighters and regular soldiers. A small and comparatively inexperienced French army was defeated at Belen by a force of Spanish regular troops. The sensation created by this defeat brought Napoleon himself to Spain with 100,000 veterans of the Grand Army. A British expeditionary force was dispatched to the peninsula in answer to a Spanish request for help and quickly drove the French out of Portugal. The campaign fought in the Iberian Peninsula over the next 6 years was a brutal guerrilla war. In 1812, it was estimated that there were between 33,000 and 50,000 Spanish irregular forces engaged in a campaign against Napoleon. The arrival of the Duke of Wellington in Portugal in 1808 provided substantial boost to anti-French campaign. Wellington's army numbered some 35,000 men, and because they lacked both artillery and cavalry, they relied heavily on guerrilla forces. He proved to be a formidable opponent, and although a cautious commander, he was able to exploit French weaknesses regarding lack of supplies, while at the same time fully utilizing British naval supremacy to resupply and reinforce his own forces. In 1810 and 11, the French Marshal Massena attacked Lisbon, failed in his objective, and suffered 25,000 casualties in the process. As Wellington shrewdly observed in 1811, there were 350,000 French troops in Spain, and yet they had no authority beyond the spot where they stood. Wellington made little impact on the general war in Europe. Britain was unable to prevent the defeat of Austria in 1809 or the invasion of Russia in 1812. In the wake of France's military commitment and disasters in Russia, however, Wellington moved on the offense. By 1812, he had captured much of Spain. Following the defeat of the French at Salmaca, he entered Madrid. Northern Spain was liberated in 1813 following his victory at Vitoria. French forces were driven back across the Pyrenees and finally defeated at Toulouse in 1814. The war in Spain was never popular in France. French military prestige was eroded during the long drawn-out campaign against guerrillas, which was both expensive and demoralizing. Napoleon aptly called it the Spanish ulcer. The improved relations between France and Russia that the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 brought had proved to be difficult to maintain, and both sides felt uncomfortable about the relationship. A number of issues caused friction between the two countries and led to a resumption of hostilities. The main factors that led to the conflict were a mutual distrust of each other's hostile expansionist aims in the Baltic, Central Europe, and the Balkans. Napoleon's refusal to support the Tsar's ambitions to seize Istanbul. Alexander attacked Sweden with French encouragement, but without French agreement seized and annexed Swedish Finland. There were arguments over the future of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. The main disagreement arose over the Tsar's virtual withdrawal from the Continental blockade. On the last day of 1810, he introduced a new trade tariff that discriminated against France and was in favor of Great Britain. Of these factors, the determination to enforce the Continental blockade was essential. The army Napoleon gathered to invade Russia was the largest he had ever assembled. It was one of the most cosmopolitan forces created since the time of the Crusades in the 12th century. The Grand Army of 600,000 consisted of Germans, Swiss, Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, Poles, and Lithuanians. Only about 270,000 of the total were Frenchmen. Napoleon had never before commanded such a large force over such a vast area. During the course of the campaign, he was inexplicably indecisive and lethargic at critical moments. On the 22nd of June, 1812, without any declaration of war, Napoleon crossed the river Niemen. He was unable to use his usual strategy of luring the enemy towards him and forcing a decisive battle early in the campaign. The much smaller Russian armies continually retreated before him, destroying food supplies as they went. Napoleon was therefore drawn even deeper into Russia, extending his supply lines and increasing the difficulties for his large, slow-moving force of catching up with his enemy. The Russian army's scorched earth tactic meant that Napoleon found it difficult to feed his men and horses. By the time Napoleon reached the outskirts of Moscow on September 7th, the Russians decided to stand and fight. In a day-long battle of enormous ferocity, Napoleon won a victory of sorts after a prolonged artillery duel, but at great cost in men and guns. The French lost 30,000 men and the Russians 50,000. On September 14th, Napoleon's advance guard rode into a largely deserted and burning Moscow. The Tsar refused to negotiate despite the loss of Moscow. The unusual mild autumn tempted Napoleon to linger in Moscow for over a month. He ignored the warnings of bad weather to come, and only the eventual realization that the Grand Army would starve to death if he stayed longer in the ruined and empty city caused him to order a return home. Laden with loot and slowed down by their wounded, the army began a retreat on October 19th, which became one of the greatest military disasters of Napoleon's career. Sickness and skirmishes, famine and exhaustion took their toll, and the onset of severe Russian winter made any problem significantly worse. The Grand Army was effectively destroyed. Only 25,000 survived to reach Germany by the end of 1812. The fragility of the imperial government was exposed by the Malet affair in October 1812, when a plot by a former general also succeeded in persuading some key officials that the emperor was dead and a provisional government needed to be formed. But the ruse failed to convince everyone, and the plotters were arrested and quickly executed. There were a number of factors which helped explain Napoleon's defeat in Russia. The Grand Army was lost through a combination of bad management, poor supply arrangements, lack of local knowledge, and overconfidence. Napoleon had allowed himself 9 weeks to defeat Russia and return in triumph to Germany. His army had only summer clothing and enough food for 3 weeks. He intended to be comfortably in Moscow by then. Many supplies proved inadequate or non-existent. There was no fodder for the horses, no frost nails for their shoes, no maps covering more than a few miles inside the Russian border, and no bandages for the wounded. There was unusual confusion in the French army command, too. One of the generals wrote after leaving Moscow, "Never was a retreat worse planned or carried out with less discipline. Never did convoys march so badly. To lack of forethought, we owed a great part of our disaster." The Russian disaster encouraged Napoleon's enemies to construct a new anti-French coalition. Although this was not a formal alliance, by late summer 1813, for the first time all great powers, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, were at war with Napoleon. In October, the numerical superiority of the combined armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia enabled them to win a decisive but expensive victory at Leipzig in the 3-day Battle of the Nations. Outnumbered, Napoleon was heavily defeated and forced back to the Rhine. His influence in Germany gone, the Grand Empire was starting to unravel. The members of the Fourth Coalition agreed a formal alliance through the Treaty of Chaumont in March 1814. This treaty, which converted the coalition into the Quadruple Alliance, committed each of the four powers not to conclude a separate peace, but to fight on until Napoleon was defeated. In France, there was discontent and opposition to the war as preparations began in bitter winter weather for a new campaign. Napoleon set to work to raise yet another army and to find money to equip it. The financial situation was desperate, and the burden of conscription had been intolerable in a country that had been at war for 20 years. Despite the fact that for the first time since 1792, France was facing invasion by the kings of old Europe, the country was war-weary and there was no real enthusiasm for continuing the struggle. Despite a series of small victories, Napoleon was unable to prevent his enemies from entering Paris in March 1814. He abdicated in favor of his young son, but the Allies restored the Bourbons, with Louis XVIII becoming the new king. The terms of Napoleon's future were settled by the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Napoleon was granted the sovereignty of the island of Elba and a pension. Following Napoleon's abdication, the future of France and its empire was discussed at Vienna. Differences between the victorious allies emerged regarding the post-war settlement. Napoleon, sensing an opportunity to split the allies and recover his throne, left Elba and landed in France to launch a new campaign, which lasted about 100 days. He immediately gathered together an army of former soldiers. His immediate targets were the two Allied armies in Belgium under Wellington and the Prussian general Blücher. Napoleon hoped to defeat them before they could combine with significant numbers of Austrian and Russian forces headed towards France. On June 18, 1815, one of the decisive battles in European history was fought near the Belgian village of Waterloo. Napoleon had a slight numerical advantage over Wellington, 72,000 men to Wellington's 68,000. The outcome of this evenly balanced struggle was ultimately determined in favor of the Allies by the arrival of the Prussians. As Wellington said the next day, it was a close thing, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Napoleon's hopes of continuing the campaign were dashed when he failed to secure further support. Without political or popular support, he had no option but to agree to demands for a second abdication. On the 8th of July, Louis XVIII made his second entry into Paris. After Napoleon's final abdication and exile in June, the Second Treaty of Paris in November 1815 reduced the frontiers of France beyond the proposals of the previous year to those of 1790. The First Empire was finally at an end.